Hello, my name is Carrie and welcome to my channel. Today I am going to talk about the month where I finally broke free of my reading slump. So without further ado, let's start talking about what I read in June by kicking off with the statistics. In the month of June, I read 7 books, which totaled in at 2,353 pages. I am so excited to see that number over 1,000 because it feels like it's been so long since I have really been reading that much. If you saw my May wrap up, you'll know that I definitely did not hit over 1,000 pages last month. So already a good sign of improvement. The format that I read these books in, all of them were actually audiobooks. So I kind of failed at reading any physical books this month. Something I succeeded at though was 3 of the 7 books were books that I owned, 3 books that were library copies, and 1 book that was a digital ARC. Something else I was glad to see this month was that the authors I was reading from were more varied. So 3 of the authors that I read from were white, 2 were Latinx, and 2 were Asian. My average rating for the month was also pretty good at 3.5. And the countries that I read from were the United States, the United Kingdom, the Dominican Republic, and Guatemala. Now that we wrapped up those statistics, let's look at the actual books that I read. I'm starting off with the book that I liked the least, and I will work my way up. The first book that I'm going to talk about today is Marriage and Masti by Nisha Sharma. I gave this book 2 stars, and I'm pretty disappointed in this one, obviously from my rating, but even more beyond the rating. I have had a very love-hate relationship with Nisha Sharma's books, which might sound weird because I have only read her If Shakespeare Were an Auntie series, which this book, Marriage and Masti, is the 3rd in that series. The first book, Dating Dr. Dill, I read, I think back in like 2020 or 2021, and I didn't really enjoy that. I thought there were some problems with the formulation of the story and the kind of plot that unfolds, and I really disliked the male lead in that one. The second book, Tastes Like Shakar, I really loved. That is one of my favorite romance books, and I thought there was a lot better character work and also more development of the characters, the storyline in that book. So when approaching Marriage and Masti, I was really wondering where I would fall on the spectrum of not liking the first book, really enjoying the second book. And unfortunately, Marriage and Masti felt a lot like Dating Dr. Dill in that there was just not enough development of things. And this story felt very weird. It almost felt like a book that belonged to a different series in terms of the writing style, the character work, the plotline also, because this kind of read like an episode of Succession in some ways, in that it's so focused on this corporate conflict that just was not that intriguing to me personally. I felt like it was over conflated and there were these really dramatized events that I think didn't properly build up the tension, the stakes, or have like the emotional payoff that you would hope they would have in a book like this. Additionally, I didn't feel like there was any development of the romance in this book. It was very much centered around insta-lust. I didn't really feel that there was this natural growth in the relationship as we see it unfold. And I'm trying to decide if I should give more background on the book because it is a 3rd in the series, so I don't want to say something that potentially spoils something from the earlier books. But I will say that the characters in this did not feel like how they felt with where we left them in the second book, especially the friendships that we see in here. It just felt out of place, and I was really disappointed in this because I had felt like this series had been so redeemed for me after book 2, and unfortunately this did not deliver for me. Although I will say that I am happy to have at least finished the series because I do have a problem of starting series and then like never actually going back to them. So small wins here. The next book is a very beloved book and also TV adapted series, and that is The Summer I Turned Pretty by Jenny Han. I gave this 3 stars. This for me is a relic of the stereotype of like the late 2000s YA romance. I thought that this was okay because obviously I'm reading this as an adult, and I see the simplicity in the story here in that this is a very minimally developed book. It's kind of jumping through these moments in a summer of this young girl's life as she has this long-standing attraction to her mom's best friend's son, but starts to develop feelings kind of for the other son as well, and there's this kind of romantic tension that builds throughout the book. I have watched at least part of the first series of the show, and I definitely do want to return to that, but I wanted to read the books first because I felt like I kind of missed out on this era of these books and their popularity because these were really popular when I was a teenager and I just never picked them up. I have realized though from reading the book that the TV show has some creative liberties that really make sense because in reading the book, Again, I thought this was okay, but there are definitely some parts to it that are really weakly developed. And the TV series, one of the biggest changes that I think is really well done is that they build in this kind of through line and like a guiding event through the summer instead of these kinds of slice of life tidbits that we get in the narrative here, which was kind of interesting to me because I had this other context of seeing what kind of changes they made and why they maybe made that. I will probably continue on with the series just because it was fun, it was an easy read, even if it wasn't anything necessarily groundbreaking for me. The next book was one that I had actually started, I think back in March. It was a short story collection. I was reading the stories here and there, and I forced myself to finish this one because I was tired of it just sitting on my currently reading shelf. And this book is Guatemalan Rhapsody by Jared Lemus. I gave this one 3 stars. This is a short story collection that was really hard for me because it mainly felt like this collection was showcasing how terrible men can be, because I believe all of the stories involved male main characters, and it's kind of looking at these slice of life stories of life in Guatemala and the United States. There are some really interesting themes being explored here, especially related to poverty, embarrassment, humiliation, and I think some of those were well done, but there were a lot of stories with men who were treating women really terribly, and I struggled with that. Yeah, it was just hard. It felt like at times it was trying to be really gritty or really shocking, and it didn't need to be that because I think the writing in this was actually pretty good. It didn't need these really dramatic scenes. It needed more exposition of the characters, and that would have made it a tighter collection in my opinion. Also, I do want to... Sorry, there's a really loud bird outside. Also, I do want to say that I would not really recommend the audiobook for this one. The narrator just was not my favorite. I found the narration at times to be a little bit confusing because I couldn't really understand the tone versus the writing. Some of the intonation sounded odd. Some of the way that things were described, I couldn't really understand the type of like purpose behind it. So that is something I do really want to point out, is that I think this would be a better physical read. I am glad that I finished this though, because again, it was on my currently reading for so long and I wasn't particularly enjoying it, but I did still want to finish it just to see how I felt about the collection as a whole. The next one is one that I have kind of gone back and forth on because I think in many ways this is a favorite book of mine, but there were also parts that I had some problems with it. So I ended up rating it 4 stars, but that is Challenger by Adam Higgenbotham. This is a pretty famous nonfiction book that is about the Challenger disaster, but it's also about a little bit more than that. We start in the book with a lead-in to the early explorations of space and early NASA projects, and how a lot of events that happen in the early days of NASA lead to better safety precautions and planning in the future, but also how NASA kind of avoided doing certain checks or following certain safety procedures because of budgetary limitations. There is a very famous quote from one of the astronauts, I forget which one, I think it might have been Buzz Aldrin, I'll insert the name if I'm incorrect about this, who said that they were concerned essentially about going up into space, knowing that the spaceship that was taking them up there was built by the lowest bidders. And I think that that is kind of the perfect tagline for this book. It's looking a lot at how both Challenger and Columbia came to be projects and the constant issues that they were kind of experiencing with them. This was a very fascinating read and I was genuinely very absorbed in this. I took a long time to finish this. I took about the entire month because there was a lot that I wanted to remember from this. I wanted to make notes about, because I entered this with no background information on Challenger or Columbia really. I learned mainly that so much of these things were preventable. It was really sad, especially knowing that many of the Challenger crew were brought on originally to be on Columbia. The mentions of Columbia in this have this like sense of foreboding or foreshadowing when you know now what happened to both Challenger and Columbia. It was just very sad how so many of these things could have been preventable, especially with Challenger. There were so many little things that went into the decision to launch that day that were really heartbreaking. This is a nonfiction book that I think is really gonna stick with me, even though, as I said, I didn't love all parts of it. The ending is one part that really sticks out to me in that the way it ended felt very odd and kind of didn't explore as much as I would hope. I thought there would be more contextualization of the meaning of this, and that was pretty limited, especially in talking about the investigations. That was more about the infighting rather than the actual investigation or the families and the aftermath for them. But I don't want to get too into like these little bits. I still really enjoyed this, and I think that this Alvarez is a really informative read. I did want to show this photo that was at the end of the book. It's a kind of gag photo that the crew of Challenger did for the Teachers in Space program, I think like promotional photo shoot. And I wanted to include this here, not only because it's an adorable photo, but also they look so happy and like they're just having fun. It's a lovely way to remember this group of people who were incredibly courageous and were unfortunately kind of failed by a system that didn't prioritize their safety. I just think it's a really amazing photo. Therefore, I wanted that to be how I ended this reflection on Challenger. The next two books I'm gonna talk about actually kind of together because they are a part of a series, and because of that, I'm talking about them actually in reverse order that they are like in the series. So the book that I rated 4 stars was The Bullet That Missed by Richard Osman, and the book that I rated 4.5 stars was The Man Who Died Twice by Richard Osman. So that second one is the second book in the series, and The Bullet That Missed is the third book in the series. If you're unfamiliar, these are books 2 and 3 in the Thursday Murder Club series. I read the first book at the end of 2025, shortly before the movie premiered, and I really like this book series. It follows a group of 4 people who are elderly and living at a retirement home in the UK, where they have a club that meets every Thursday to look at murders and kind of talk about their theories or try to solve cold cases. The second book really was a great follow-up to the first book. It did not suffer from second book syndrome for me. I thought it was really well done. In terms of the threads of the mystery and the plotting were much tighter than in the first book. I thought that it was better planned out, and I loved the characters and their progression here, the kinds of new arcs that we got in this book as well. I think this was a good book that still transitions the series into another mystery for the third book, but carries its own weight against the first book. So that was why it was slightly higher for me in terms of the rating between books 2 and 3. Book 3 I also enjoyed. I think the initial mystery was really intriguing in this one, but the story kind of lost focus for a lot of the book. I felt like the central mystery was really not progressing. That happens with some mysteries, but here unfortunately it was because information was being intentionally kept from the reader that became a little frustrating at a certain point. I just think the mystery element was not as well crafted in the thick of the story. And while I did love some of the new characters that were introduced in this book and some of the arcs that we got, there was noticeably less development than in the second book. So again, it just was kind of missing the mark just a little bit for me. The ending to this book was very well done, and it has definitely left me curious about what will happen in book 4. I will be continuing on with the series. I love the characters too much to stop. I am very curious if book 4 is going to be, where the story will gradually slump a bit for me, or if it will be a surprise turnaround. So we will see what the future holds. The last book and my best book of June was actually literally the last book that I read in June, and that was Visitations by Julia Alvarez. This is a new poetry collection from Alvarez, who is probably most famous for her novels, like How the Garcia Girls Lost Their Accents, or In the Time of Butterflies. However, she is also a poet. This poetry collection consists of completely new poems. It starts out from her childhood in the Dominican Republic throughout the course of her life, which was really interesting because you can kind of track the really important moments in her life and see the poet and the author grow into herself. I really loved this collection, mainly because there is so much nostalgia in this. There is this rumination on a childhood in a time where she was somewhat naive to the larger scale of problems in the Dominican Republic, but also living this life where she felt very connected to her family, her sisters especially. I loved the exploration of her relationships with her siblings, with her parents, and the different phases of her life that she had to navigate in the United States. There was also such an intentionality to this collection, both in terms of the way that these poems were organized within the collection and the cohesiveness between them, as well as the selection of poems. While I think that there is a really great through line between these poems, they also, even though somewhat stylistically they differ, there is a narrative voice to these poems that I felt was really strong and really emphasized the types of themes about longing and happiness and joy and tragedy that Alvarez wanted to show in this collection. There is also a really amazing author's note in the aftermath of the poems that reflects on why Alvarez named this collection Visitations. I thought that was really beautiful, and I loved the way that she expressed her involvement in this collection and the editing process, the publishing process. I felt that the naming of this collection as Visitations really hit home for me because this book is haunting in a way. There is like a certain way that she captures sadness and longing and nostalgia while simultaneously showing these really joyful moments and these moments of happiness that felt like they would last forever, that were just some things that really resonated with me very deeply. I had never read anything by Alvarez before this collection, and I definitely want to rectify that because her poetry was absolutely beautiful. I really could not have imagined how much I would fall in love with this. So for me, this was a great way to end the month, and also I think to end this video. I would love to hear your thoughts about what you have been reading, or if you've read any of these books, please let me know. I hope your summer reading is off to a great start and that you are surviving these heat waves. Thank you so much for watching, and happy reading. Bye!